Forward to that conversation with the NBA Finals beginning tomorrow night with the Raptors hosting Golden State. Jalen will be flying to Toronto right after the show today, and Damon Jones is with us here this morning as well. And as we await the commissioner, there's one thing we did not get a chance to address in our previous hour because the two of you were yelling at each other. And as a consequence, we wound up blowing off completely a conversation we were going to have that I think is interesting. And let's take this moment here as we await Adam Silver to preview these finals. And a comment you made in our meeting this morning, DJ, I basically said this. I believe if Kevin Durant does not play, that Steph Curry and Klay Thompson have to combine for 60 points a game. If they don't give the Warriors 60 points a game, I don't believe the Warriors win. I don't believe they win any game that those two guys don't score 60 points in. And you made a very interesting case in reaction to me about the pace at which you think the series will be played.
Well, they don't necessarily have to score 60 points, but one thing that they have to do, and it's very, very important, is they have to be efficient and they cannot turn the basketball over because these are two really good defensive teams, so it's not going to be a lot of transition basketball. It's going to be a lot of half-court sets, and you're going to have to get a shot every single time. So being efficient with your passes, your cuts, and things of that nature is going to help you win this game.
But what we have seen the Warriors do and what they just destroyed Portland with, Jalen, and this is the Warriors at their best, is they get out in transition and they use that transition to turn it into threes. Unlike old teams who punctuate their fast breaks with slam dunks, they like to punctuate their fast breaks with wide open threes. That's why I believe they need to do that. But DJ was telling me in the morning meeting today, he thinks that the pace of the series is going to be slow and the scoring will be comparatively lower.
That's why I'm picking the Toronto Raptors to win the series. And here's how I would match up. I will put Danny Green on Steph Curry. While he's struggling to shoot the basketball, he's still a lockdown defender. I would put Kyle Lowry on Klay Thompson. He's a terrific catch-and-shoot player, but the more times he dribbles, the less efficient that possession becomes. I would put Kawhi Leonard on Andre Iguodala, and here's why. I'll put Pascal Siakam on Draymond Green. The most effective and the most run play in the Portland Trail Blazers series was Steph Curry pick and rolls with Looney and or Draymond Green. I would put Kawhi on AI so that now he becomes the roamer, the helper, the middle linebacker for that action.
And that is where the absence of Kevin Durant perhaps is felt the most in this series. If Durant is playing and is some semblance of himself, I mean, from a health standpoint with his calf, then that becomes Kawhi's matchup,
and then they end up starting Bogut to match up with Gasol. So that plays into Toronto's hands as well.
Yeah, it really does. And if KD's able to play, they get to that Hampton 5 lineup, okay? And that's where they're better defensively with that lineup because they could switch everything with KD.
I understand that, but what I'm talking about is how much does Kawhi have to work on the defensive end? If you have him on a healthy Durant, then you're putting him one-on-one with the best scorer in the game and one of the best scorers in the history of the game. If he's not, and he's guarding Andre Iguodala, that is a very different, with no disrespect intended, that is a very different workload on the defensive end for a guy who was also their best offensive player.
And isn't me, but the Hamptons are overrated.
I've never been to the Hamptons.
You're talking about the Hamptons 5, or you're talking about the actual geographic location?
The actual geographic Hamptons is overrated.
Not from
it's overpriced.
Not from a golf perspective, it's not.
but to your point, exactly right. When Kawhi doesn't have to guard an all-time great scorer like Kevin Durant, now he can do what he did against Philly. Remember, he was guarding Ben Simmons, and all he did was become a helper, clog up the middle, get steals, get runouts, get dunks, and he's a former Defensive Player of the Year in that position.
So Kawhi Leonard, he's taking the Raptors to win this series, regardless of the way it plays out, and you believe the Warriors are going to win. Give me 30 seconds on why, as Adam Silver is just about here.
I'm taking the Warriors to win this series in 7 games. If Kevin Durant comes back, I see them winning in 6.
And 7 games would mean winning it on the road, winning it in Toronto's building in a decisive 7th game.
Because they're the defending champions. They've been there. They've done it. This is their 5th time. All the experience is in their favor, and I just like those guys and what they're doing.
I'm being told that the commissioner of the NBA is here. And there he is. I see him as he makes his way over. Come on over, please, Commissioner, if you will. Wonderful to have you. That's the commissioner of the NBA, Adam Silver, who makes his way
how you doing?
to our desk here. It's good to see you, as
Thanks
always.
for joining us.
Commissioner, thank you. Have a seat, please. Come on in and make yourself at home. You know, Damon Jones, obviously. This is not normally the way we greet our guests, but it works out that way. How are you?
Well, our score has a cool commissioner.
To confirm,
you know what I'm saying?
To confirm that we are live right now, making sure that you're aware of that. And good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Your way here. Thank you. And so I want to start right, and we'll just jump right into it here. As we were sitting here breaking down the series, which opens tomorrow night, and obviously the consequence of having a Canadian team in these finals for the first time, the first truly international NBA Finals for your sport, which is so global in nature right now. What does that mean for the league? What specifically does that mean for the NBA to have Canada in these finals?
Yeah, well, to your point, it clearly demonstrates what an international sport we are. I mean, I look at what progress we've made in Canada since we expanded in '94. We have more players from Canada, other than the United States, than any other country right now. I think we have 13 players from Canada right now. The sport has become enormously popular with young people there. And also Toronto in particularly is an incredibly diverse city. I think it's very representative of the modern NBA, where 25% of our league is composed of players that were born outside the United States. So I think it's a signal of sorts to a global market. Of course, we've talked about expanding potentially to other countries as well, and I think it also demonstrates that, I mean, in the NBA world, still a relatively young franchise, having come into the league in '94, and look at the progress they've made, and I think finally just demonstrates what you can do with strong ownership as they have there, and great management, and so we're thrilled.
And as a former Raptor, I'm really happy for Toronto, because it's one thing when you play in the United States, you have a city or a state rooting for a team. It's something vastly different when you have an entire country rooting for a team. And that's where you see the massive crowds outside at Jurassic Park. This is something that we normally don't see in the NBA. And it's really refreshing that it's going to get a chance to play out on the final stage.
It almost has like a college atmosphere to it. Again, Jalen will be there by the end of the day, and I'm sure you'll be there, of course, tomorrow night for Game 1. I want to get to a bunch of other issues around the sport here, and I will start with this, because we're all anticipating, as well as these finals, obviously, and then the draft, and then July 1st will come, and we, the Get Up crew, are going to do a bunch of specials around that, because that's become such an incredibly important week. And I will admit, when this first started 5-6 years ago, whenever it was, when a lot of big star players started moving around in the summers, my initial reaction was, this is terrible for the NBA. And I sit here today, and I think I have to admit I was wrong. My sense of it is this has actually wound up increasing the interest in the sport. What data do you have that demonstrates the way player movement has impacted fans' interest in all of your games?
Data? I'd say it's a balance. So we have a system still designed to create an advantage for the incumbent team. I mean, the whole notion of the supermax, whole notion of a longer contract for a player on your team. So it's not that we want to disfavor the team that currently has that player under contract, even when they become free agents. But on the other hand, it's also a way of rebirth, of reforming a franchise. And so you want a certain amount of change in the league. You know, and the other part that gets lost sometimes when changing the system and creating shorter contracts, it also creates greater incentives for players. I mean, players are like anybody else who, you know, has a contract. And to the extent where you have essentially 4- and 5-year contracts right now, it creates very different incentives when players are getting to the end of those contracts than it did in the old days when guys used to have 9-year contracts and 7-year contracts. And if you have a system where you have a set pool of money, so roughly now 50% of the money goes to the players, it becomes an issue of how that money is going to get distributed. And I think our theory was, if you go to shorter contracts, you have less money that isn't being utilized. If you have guys, in essence, who were incredibly valuable and had the leverage to get a 9-year contract, but then everyone sort of realized when they got their 9-year contract, maybe they're going to have 5 great years and tail off. This way, the players who deserve the money are still getting it, but then next group of players get money because there's more free agency. And so we're at the point now where roughly 40% of our players will be free agents this summer. So we think it's good for the league. I get it from the other standpoint, you know, for a team that's losing that free agent. And then the question is, how do you build a system where teams are, in essence, players are giving those teams appropriate notice so that they don't end up, in essence, with nothing when it comes to the end of that contract, and the player who they thought was going to stay decides they're going to leave.
Commissioner, this is the most anticipated offseason I can recall in the history of the NBA. As we go into the NBA Finals, the best players on each team, Kevin Durant and Kawhi Leonard, are amongst those 40% free agents you just talked about. There's a good chance that both of those guys could be on new teams come next season. Do you feel like this is good for the game?
First, I don't know if there's a good chance that both those players will be on new teams next season. I really don't, and I'm not even sure they know. I think my experience in dealing with these players, they're still young men. I think different people suggest different things to them. Ideas change, success, failure have impacts on their decisions. But as I said, I think it's got to be a balance. I respect their right to become free agents. Teams, everyone with eyes wide open, sign those players, certain length contracts. I mean, the case out in Golden State, they made a decision there to enter into shorter contracts with their players. It created more flexibility for everyone. So we'll see. I mean, it's hard for me to jump over the finals right now that haven't started and go directly to free agency. But the answer is I really don't know. I will say, sort of where I started, there is a preference for players to stay with their team. It's the way we, together with the Players Association, built the collective bargaining agreement. So players are giving up money to leave their team. People have also suggested to us that maybe in our system they're not giving up enough money, that there should be even a greater incentive for players to stay in their current team. But that's something we're constantly trying to calibrate and find the right balance.
I want to go to the next thing here again, which we'll just sort of get as much as we can. The Commissioner, Adam Silver, good enough to come down to our studio on the eve of these finals. There's not one friend I have who is a Knicks fan who is speaking to me right now, because the day after the lottery, I said that it was a great thing for the NBA that these teams jumped up from nowhere, if you will, in the new system that you guys instituted, and that New Orleans winds up with Zion and all the things that wound up happening as it did. How did you feel? How did the league feel that the new rules you put in place to try to keep teams from tanking, how did you feel that worked?
I feel it worked. It was interesting. I of course, live in New York, and others would come up to me before the draft lottery and say, what are the Knicks' chances? And I said, they're 14%.
Right. They didn't get that. Like they just never quite grasped that.
They said, no, but I mean, what are their chances? And I said, there's an 86% chance they won't get the first pick. It's just math. Yeah. And so it worked the way we hoped. I will also say to Knicks fans, I mean, frankly, they still got a great pick. I mean, we'll see. I mean, the player that's projected to go number 3 is clearly going to be a game changer. And so you could argue that in terms of teams' incentives to rebuild, they're clearly still there. I mean, the Knicks were undergoing, in essence, a sort of rebuilding program, and they ended up with the 3rd pick in the draft. So I don't think that's all bad. But I think most importantly in terms of these changes, because the teams are, of course, sophisticated, they understand the math of the draft lottery. I think the most important change, I think it's going to demonstrate to fans in markets that they should stop rooting for teams to lose.
Yes.
That was to me the most corrosive, because I feel in some cases for teams, even their general managers knew better. They knew they had to build culture over time. They knew that once they added a great player to the team, that it wasn't in their interest to continue to be in this constant rebuilding mode. But the fans, and in some cases the media locally, were saying, what are you, an idiot? That's the worst thing to do, to be in the middle. You should keep losing. So I think hopefully we've turned the corner on that.
I think we have, and you did a great job with that. And the other thing is load management. As somebody that played in the league, I remember a day where we played 4 games in 5 nights. We were required to practice after games. The burn was a lot more heavy. And you guys have done a terrific job of trying to elongate the careers of players. But then you see a guy like Kawhi Leonard, who's missed a lot of games this year due to load management. He's the ace player on his team, and it seemed like it paid off. Do you think that now is going to create a trend?
Yeah, I don't, and here's why. Because I don't think it's fair to characterize those missed games in the case of Kawhi as so-called load management. I put that in the category of injury recovery. I mean, remember, he missed almost the entire prior season. We were in touch with his doctors and the team, and they created a program for him to get back to NBA playing shape. And that's really what was happening with him. And if you look at the so-called load management for other top players in the league, at the end of the day, if you go down the list, and you guys should show it, they miss very few games. I mean, I think Steph Curry was out 1 game for so-called load management. I mean, you have players who are injured and out for those things, but I think we've struck a pretty good balance. I mean, it's a longer issue in terms of the science as to whether an 82-game season is optimal, plus a long playoffs, and that's something we'll continue to look at.
It's been fascinating to me that you have actually raised the notion of shortening the season, which is something that usually people like us in the media just throw out there as though it's the easiest thing in the world to do. But you yourself have raised it as, it feels like to me, something that could be a possibility.
It's a possibility. I mean, there's no doubt it's an economic issue right now. At least under our current format, if we reduce the number of games, we reduce the amount of television money, reduce the amount of ticket money. Having said that, as we start to look at ways to reformat the season, it may not just go to length. It may be, as I've said, maybe there's a preseason tournament, a midseason tournament, a play-in tournament. I mean, other things that create incentives for players to compete throughout the year, that maybe we still have a season that begins roughly late October, goes to mid-June, but there's multiple things to compete for. And I think that's part of the issue. We have to keep up with changing media times. People's attention spans are shorter. There's a lot more options for when it comes to entertainment, unlimited channels over the top and with the internet. And to me, one of the things we have to really study, if especially winning teams are able to rest players at strategic times, you're sending a pretty clear signal to your fans that those games aren't all that important. Put aside load management or anything else. And I think especially with the young fans in this day and age, they want to know what they're watching matters. And so as we look at a regular season that's roughly 50 years old, everything else is changing around us in society. The game, to me, is fantastic. But is there a better way of formatting it and creating better competition? That's something we're looking at right now.
Something I feel like we could talk about for 3 hours. There's two more things I need to get to here. I know we have a limited time with you. We had a young man.
I'm not in a hurry.
Okay. Well, listen,
don't blame it on me.
Mike Bass, we'll check with Mike afterwards to see how long we can do. But anyway, we had R.J. Hampton sitting in that seat yesterday. He's a high school player who made a decision, announced it live on our show, to go play overseas in Australia rather than go play the 1 year that he would in college. And we all found it really interesting. And we'll wait and see how it could really turn out to be something of a test case. And we'll have to wait and see how that winds up going. But I guess from an NBA perspective, what did you think of that decision? And how, if at all, do you think it will impact the way players will choose coming into your league?
First of all, Australia has a fantastic development system. Australia, I may get this off a little bit, but I think their population is around 24 million. And so a country of 24 million, they have around a dozen NBA players in the league right now. So pound for pound, one of the best basketball countries in the world. And we've studied sort of the Australia academy system, and there they take their young players and they move them. I don't know if they quite call it a professional track, but they become full-time ball players. You know, once they hit 14 or so, they're designated based on, you know, aptitude they've shown, in some cases when it comes to basketball, height or other things. And so I think from that standpoint, if I had a son or if I were advising someone and said, where are you going to go to develop? Australia is one of the best places to do that. I'd also say the league has been studying that system a lot because we've opened academies in other parts of the world. We have academies now in China, we have academies in India, we have academies in Africa. So I think for him, I think, again, that's a decision that an individual player, of course, should have the ability to make, especially when they're 18 years old. The last piece I'll say on that, I am a little jealous because we are, in our G League, trying to create our own professional track. And to the extent that, and I haven't talked to him yet or his advisors, but to the extent he decided he was better off in Australia than our G League, I think I'm gonna, talk to Commissioner Sharif of the G League and say, what should we be looking at differently? Because I think there are things we should be doing differently so that for an American player who decides that college isn't for me and I want to, as RJ said, I want to spend full time devoted to the game of basketball, that's my best chance to be in the NBA, there should be an alternative opportunity in the U.S. to do that.
I agree. If and when do you anticipate high school players having the ability to go straight from high school to enter the NBA draft?
Well, I just say what we have talked about previously is making that change in 2022. It has to be negotiated with the Players Association, and I'll just say we are in ongoing discussions with them on that issue.
All right, fair enough. Here's what I'm going to do, because we have a million other things we want to get to here. Well, actually, I have 1 minute, but I'm told that the commissioner is going to be able to stay, so we'll save a few things that I'm delighted I can. But since I have that minute, the one thing that we will not get out of this, I mean, you get these kids coming into your league who are major stars, and this year might be a bit of an outlier, but Zion Williamson is already one of the 5 biggest stars in American sports before he even sets foot on a court in the NBA. So if players start not going to college and not getting that exposure, is that something that you think would change the dynamic of all of this?
Not necessarily. I mean, what we're watching now, I mean, Zion's a great example. Zion was a great